Welcome everyone. It is my extraordinary pleasure to introduce to you Jayanti Owens, who's an assistant professor of sociology and public policy at Brown. Jayanti's work spans a broad range of issues in social demography, integrating questions of gender and race into the study of education and labor market inequalities. Her work is intensely intersectional, as that term is used in gender and women's studies or ethnic studies, at the same time as it is quantitatively rigorous. And although perhaps not entirely unique, this certainly puts her in a very small category of people who speaks across such a broad range of fields. Jayanti began her education at Swarthmore College in political science. For Ron's benefit, I'll note that as an undergraduate, she won an award from the Peace Corps for doing work enhancing diversity in the Peace Corps. After her undergraduate degree, she then went to Princeton for her MA and PhD. She was a Robert Wood Johnson Fellow at Madison for 2 years before taking up her position at Brown last fall. Her CV is extraordinarily paper intensive for someone so at her career stage. We're going to have to make her slow down or she's going to deforest us. She lists nearly 20 grants and fellowships, including those from the Social Science Research Council, the National Science Foundation, the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, and of course, RWJ. She's already published papers in a range of journals, from sociology of religion to ethnic and racial studies to the sociology of education, again, commensurate with the broad range of her intellectual interests. Her title today is Coloring the Boys Will Be Boys, Chronicle, Race, Gender, and Behavior Problems in the U.S. Across 2 Decades, and is derived, I think, in part from her dissertation research, if I've understood correctly. Please join me in welcoming Professor Owens.
So thank you so much for that really nice introduction, Jenna, and also congrats on making it to the Peace Corps section of the CV. That is not something that people mostly get to. It's really a pleasure to be here today. I'm really honored to be able to share some of this work with you, and I want to start by just saying a little bit about why I chose this specific paper to share with you, for 2 reasons. One is because I think you guys in this room are probably one of the best groups to give me feedback on this paper, so I'm really excited to get your specific thoughts on it. And 2, because some people in this room have seen earlier versions of this work, and I'm excited to share with you sort of how this paper has come along and get your thoughts on sort of what you see for the next steps before I get it under review. Okay, so the sort of idea behind this paper is that this phrase, boys will be boys, shows up sort of throughout the popular press and newspapers, in the media, and yet I would argue that there hasn't really been a lot of attention to the way that race and gender intersect in telling this story about sort of behavioral and normative expectations about boys' behavior. The focus for this study is the United States. So one of the things that I think people in this room know really well is that over the last 3 or 4 decades, there's really been an exponential rise in a number of things, demographic trends in the United States that have created increasingly blocked opportunities for young African American men in the United States. So these range from things like the exponential rise of mass incarceration since the 1970s. Today, nearly 40% of African American men experience some time in prison by the time they're 40. There's also been a really sharp increase in exclusionary discipline practices in schools. These are things like suspension and expulsion. And these are things that have led some people to talk about something called the school-to-prison pipeline, this idea that starting when kids are very, very young, that their paths are in some ways laid out before them, and they look quite grim for a lot of boys of color. So over 30% of African American boys today experience school suspension or expulsion by age 18. And I think one of the things that's really striking about this trend is that suspension and expulsion has increased even at the earliest ages. So if you can believe this, 15% of African American boys are suspended or expelled by age 9, 3rd or 4th grade, right? This is before they've even really had a chance to, figure out what options are in front of them and sort of how to navigate the school system. So this just shows you kind of an idea of what this looks like. Sorry that it's a little bit distorted on your screen. But basically what you can see is the line on the top is African Americans, the line on the bottom is whites, and you can see that over time, the percent of boys that have ever been suspended has increased more sharply for African American boys compared to white boys. So the idea that I think about in this paper is that this rise in exclusionary discipline practices may actually reflect changes in underlying behavior ratings. So boys' higher suspension and expulsion rates at baseline may be due in part, or in fact are due in part, to their higher average behavior problems. So a wide range of literature in developmental psychology has shown that boys score about a half a standard deviation higher than girls in behavior problems throughout childhood. These are things like self-regulation problems, the ability to practice self-discipline, delay gratification, control one's temper. One of the sort of common experiments that's shown around self-regulation is the marshmallow experiment. So you put one marshmallow in front of a kid and you tell them, I have to go and get something. If you can wait before eating this marshmallow until I come back, I'll give you 2 marshmallows. And a really surprising number of kids don't wait for the other marshmallow. Presumably they do like marshmallows. So it's not just that they're trying to get out of the exercise. There's also a range of social problems that are involved here, things like getting along with peers and teachers, making friends. And increasingly, sort of the suspension and expulsion of African American boys may be linked to worsening behavior ratings, but this isn't something that people have really examined in the literature, whether there have been changes in these ratings, and if so, why that would be. So, also as, oh, yes.
So we saw suspension going up quite a bit too. Is there some other context changing in the schools where suspension and discipline is just becoming more common for everybody?
Yes, so there's definitely been a rise, I would say, across schools in the practice of zero tolerance policies. So this is sort of this idea that the best way to address these issues is just to get kids out of the classroom. And I think this is something that affects boys across the board, but it's much, much more pronounced among African Americans. I think also things like pressure towards increasingly high-stakes testing and so forth in schools has created a variety of sort of interesting pressures on teachers in how they think about dealing with keeping scores high or raising scores, and getting kids out of the classroom has increasingly been sort of one way of doing that. So there's also been a number of pretty prominent changes in families over the same time period. And there's many possible explanations for why there may be changing behaviors, but one of the things that I do in this paper is to think through how some of the changes that we've seen in families over the last 30 years may be implicated in some of the changes that we've seen in boys' behavior ratings. So we know that the rise in suspension and expulsion is largest among African Americans, and that this is also where a lot of family changes have been most pronounced. So what I do in this paper is I examine whether shifts in family structures and sibling composition over the past 4 decades may help explain some of the changing ratings that I find in this paper. I want to be really clear up front that the goal in doing this is not to sort of move the impetus away from schools in thinking about how they address exclusionary discipline practices, but rather to examine whether parent reports of behaviors which are less susceptible to things like age for grade bias in reporting of behavior problems, and pressures due to things like testing and zero tolerance practices have also changed, and if so, why? So changes in school discipline and criminal justice are also accompanied by a number of changes, specifically in demographic trends within families. So some of these include the rise in women's educational attainment in the US. The gender gap in college completion, for example, is largest among African Americans in the United States. More educated African American mothers may actually over time have developed higher behavioral standards for their children, in part because of their own education and the outlooks that they expect for their children. But it also may mean that sons' behaviors are more scrutinized, since behaviors predict educational success, and under 35% of bachelor's degrees today are awarded to African American men. So this shows you trends in bachelor's degree receipt for African Americans on the top and whites on the bottom. This is the percent that's given to women. So you can see that under 35% of bachelor's degrees today are awarded to African American men. This, again, as Josh pointed out, this is a trend that we've seen for whites as well, but the absolute difference in the percent awarded to men, and African American men, is much smaller. There's also been delays in childbearing and decreasing total fertility rates over this time period. So we've seen between 1983 and 2001 that the median age of childbearing shifted up 2 years, from age 25 in 1983 to age 27 in 2001, which implies that there's also fewer children being born to any given mother, and that this may create sort of greater behavioral expectations, especially if moms are having a boy, right? So this idea of fewer children, greater investment in those children. If you have a boy, that may mean that you know that things are not looking so good for boys in terms of education in general in the United States, especially so for African American boys, and that may lead you to sort of have greater behavioral expectations for those boys if you believe that behavior is a predictor of educational outcomes. There's also been,
So those expectations come from the parents or from the schools would have greater behavioral expectations?
I would say for both, right? So I think schools would definitely have those expectations in the sense that they may not, they may be more likely to use exclusionary discipline as a way to address those behaviors, but in families, moms want their sons to do well, right? And they may believe that to the extent that their sons have higher levels of behavioral development early on, they're more likely to succeed in a system that's not really set up for their success.
Right, but so are schools making the quality quantity trade-off on behalf of parents?
This is about, I'm arguing this about moms in
About
particular.
moms.
Yeah.
So that explains more suspension for black stuff? Okay.
Well, so stay with me and see if we get to this. So another major demographic trend that we've seen in families is increasing family instability and biological father absence in households. And there's been some research that shows that increasing father absence may hurt boys' social development and behavioral development more than girls. So this just shows you, again, trends for African Americans on the top, whites on the bottom. This is percent of kids who are raised without a stably present father by age 18. And again, you can see a much larger, much higher levels for African Americans than for whites. So another change included in this sort of change in family composition is the rise in blended families, right? So with multiple partner transitions, there's also been a rise in sort of the presence of cohabiting non-biological or social fathers within families, as well as sort of unstably single mothers. So this is mothers who, at any survey wave that you catch them, may report being single, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they haven't had partner sort of transitions over this time period, and we just caught them in a moment where they're unpartnered. So numbers of children in households may actually have increased despite decreasing fertility rates overall because of changes in sort of household composition and the rise in sort of new partners that may bring with them children from prior arrangements. So increasing multi-partner fertility may also come out of this, so there may be a rise in mothers having a child with each new partner, and obviously there's been a lot of work showing that this is the case to some extent. Increasing cohabitation between children from different partnerships is also another sort of thing that we might see and have seen in these transitions. So this may also, these family changes may also shape sort of the family gender dynamics within households, right? So the number of children in a household is non-random, but in the United States, child gender is randomly assigned. And so in families with more boys, we may see that boys actually act out more, that parents may be more stressed, and there's a number of reasons that we may see that these factors would lead to worse behavior ratings of sons. So parents may expect elder sons to serve as role models for younger sons. So in situations where there's multiple boys present in the household, we may see behavior problem ratings go up for boys. And parents may be more worried about their sons' behaviors and educational prospects, especially once they enter school. So this sort of connects to Danny's question a little bit about whether this is a school process or a family process. And together, these factors may lead African American mothers to rate their sons' behaviors worse over time, potentially even among boys with relatively low levels of behavior problems. So in this study, what I sort of put forth is this idea that prior work, to my knowledge, hasn't specifically examined changes in reports of the early behavior problems of African American boys born today compared to 30 years ago, prior to some of these major demographic shifts that we've seen in schools and in families. So in this study, I draw on two cohorts of children, one that's born in the 1980s, the other that's born in the 2000s, to examine whether there's been a shift in the way moms rate African American boys' early behavior problems today compared to decades ago. So I asked 3 specific questions. The first is, has the gender gap in early childhood behavior problems among African American children grown over the past 30 years? If so, where in the behavioral distribution has this growth occurred? Second, how much of the growth is due to changes in family composition or family gender dynamics? And third, are family composition and gender dynamics implicated because of differential selection into these family types, given the rise of single parent and repartnered families over the past 30 years? So why we should care. So one of the things that I've done in some of my earlier work is shown how gender differences, if you look at a cohort of kids that's born in the 1980s, gender differences in these early childhood behavior problems in the 1980s is linked to gender differences in educational attainment through college degree completion when kids are in their late 20s and early 30s. So among individuals born in the 1980s, boys' higher behavior problems scale up to produce a macro-level gender gap in educational attainment that explains about 25% of today's gender gap in high school completion and about 15% of the gender gap in college completion. And there's evidence of significant continuity in the average gender gap in behavior problems throughout childhood. So the behaviors that kids form when they're young have pretty strong implications for their educational outcomes down the road. We also know that there's pretty large racial and ethnic differences in the magnitude of the gender gap in educational attainment that carries pretty significant implications for social inequality. So in particular, males' education also shapes their future labor market opportunities, marriage markets, child well-being in the next generation, and has some pretty serious implications for intergenerational inequality and opportunities for upward mobility. So in this study, I focused specifically on early childhood externalizing problems. So this is a composite measure of self-regulation problems and social problems. It ranges behavior items like hyperactivity and impulsivity, inattention, difficulty delaying gratification, and also social problems like aggression, outbursts, and difficulty making friends. So as I mentioned, boys have long held a roughly half a standard deviation disadvantage in the development of early childhood behavior, so they have higher average externalizing problem scores overall. So in this study, what I do is I compare African American boys to African American girls because these kids are raised in the same households, and this will allow me to look at whether there's gender differences between blacks and whites compared to between white boys and white girls. So I'm basically looking at the difference in the difference when you look at blacks compared to whites. So there's some possible implications of the changing maternal characteristics at birth that I just talked about with regard to things like delays in childbearing, decreasing number of children, and so forth. So you can sort of take 2 perspectives on this. So from a biologic perspective, one might say that with the sort of rise of with delays in childbearing and older mothers, their moms that are having kids today may have lower egg quality, right? And this lower egg quality may be associated with greater behavior problems. There's been some work showing this. From a social change perspective, on the other hand, some might argue that between the 1980s and the 2000s, sort of social meaning of having a child at, say, age 25 has changed, right? So what would sort of made you a normal age if you were having a kid at 25 in the 1980s may make you a bit of a younger mother today in the 2000s, given these delays in childbearing that we've seen. And with fewer children and older and more educated mothers, we may see that moms actually have higher behavioral standards, especially for their boys. Conversely, though, the rising biological father absence that we've seen in the rise in blended families may also mean that boys get away with sort of poor behaviors at home, and that this may lead to sort of the worst behavior ratings that we're seeing from moms. So methodologically, one of the sort of big questions that I'm grappling with in this paper is how do we examine the shifting child behaviors and how they might be shaped by both biological factors and changing social norms, right? So on the one hand, you could argue that this is really a biologic phenomenon, and if kids' behaviors are getting worse, that this may be due to changes in ages of childbearing that we've seen over this time period. Alternatively, it may be that these social changes have social meanings that mean that comparing moms who are the same ages in the 2000s to those in the 1980s isn't really an equivalent comparison because the meaning of having kids at a particular age with a particular level of education and a particular relationship status has also changed over this time period.
Sorry.
Yeah.
is there a useful distinction between sort of objective behavior and mothers' perceptions of behavior as they report it? Or are we really interested in, I don't know if those can be separated or should be separated. So in other words,
Yes.
there could be a question that says, does he hit anyone? And then there could be a question that says, does he act out? And I guess even hitting could be subjectively interpreted. So how do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. So I think of it in a couple of ways. So the majority of this paper focuses on mother ratings because this is what we have across time periods. I do think there are certain strengths to that, right? So things like there's a vast literature in education that shows that there are teacher biases in the ways that kids' behaviors are interpreted, which is not to say that moms may not also have some of those same biases, but rather that their biases are probably colored by different sorts of dynamics and interactions within the home than teachers, and they don't have as clear of a direct sort of incentive with the rise in sort of high stakes testing and zero tolerance policies over this time period to sort of rate boys worse as a way to get them out of a classroom in order to raise test scores of kids overall in the class, right? The other thing that I would say is that we know from the social psychological literature that the ways that moms rate kids have consequences, right? Like those ratings, regardless of whether they're true or not, have, you know, they influence the way that kids, sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy in some ways, right? That said, I'm completely sensitive to your question, and one of the things that I've done is looked at the way that sort of objective coders, who may or may not be so objective, but objective coders who are going into households and rating kids' temperament, so like things like fussy temperament and those sorts of behaviors. Unfortunately, they're only available when kids are a little bit younger. Ideally, I would have them, I'd be able to compare mom and interviewer ratings at ages 4 and 5, which is the ages that I'm looking at here. I don't have the ability to do that, but I do have some results that I can show you at the end on comparisons between interviewers and moms of temperament. Okay, so what I do in this paper, again, is really compare the ways that these early behavior problems are rated by moms in the 1980s to the 2000s, with a really important sort of underwriting question being, how do you construct an equivalent cohort of moms in the 2000s, given that we know that there's been all of these family and social changes that may mean that doing a straight one-to-one comparison of a 25-year-old mom in 1980s to a 25-year-old mom in 2000s may not actually have the same social meaning over this time period. On the other hand, if you're considering biologic factors, you may actually want to do that one-to-one comparison. So what's the best way to go about doing this? Ultimately, I do it in a number of different ways. The results end up being quite consistent across both. So I'll just give you a quick preview of the findings right now. So I'm looking at 4 and 5-year-old boys externalizing behavior problems. These are the self-regulation and social problems that I talked about. And I find that the entire externalizing problems distribution for African American boys has shifted up over this time period, such that even the best behaved boys, those with the lowest behavior problem ratings, are being rated worse over time, and that this is pretty uniquely concentrated among African Americans. Fewer African American boys with the lowest scores today, so basically we've seen a distribution that's left skewed overall has shifted up for African American boys more than for African American girls or for white boys.
These are mother's ratings?
Mother ratings. And that there's basically more African American boys with scores around the median of the distribution and higher. Whereas for girls, for African American girls, the percentage of girls with the lowest scores have remained consistent over this time period. Turns out that the presence of a younger brother accounts entirely for this reported worsening among African American boys compared to girls. Another question that comes up is this specifically about a younger brother, or is there something about just more boys in general, such that even having an older brother would make a difference? And it turns out that that does hold to some extent. So it really is a story about multiple boys in the household, but there seems to be something in particular about a younger boy as well.
So are you implying that there are more, any African American boys is more likely to have a younger sibling?
Not that, so I look at this and find that they're not actually more likely to have a younger sibling. It's that when they have a younger sibling, when they have a younger brother in particular, they're rated worse by their moms.
But that's more so now than 30
More so now than 30 years ago. Yep, and this turns out to not be a story about changing selection into who has a younger brother over this time period.
And this is a full biological brother or a co-residing?
This is a co-residing, not necessarily biological brother. So these are based on household rosters, where basically we're told at a given age how many at a given age for the vocal
So that
child.
could be another change going on.
Yes, absolutely. So I've thought about that a little bit, and I'd love to share some thoughts with you on that in the Q&A too. Okay. So the first data set I use in the study comes from the children of the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth. So the NLSY has about 6,900 kids that are born 1979 to 2010 to women who were aged 14 to 21 in 1979. It contains really great detailed developmental information every other year between the ages of 4 and 16. And sort of I think about how to compare the NLSY sample to the ECLSB sample, given that the NLSY has siblings sampled within the study as well, whereas the ECLSB, which is the next data set that I use, has a single birth cohort of kids. So it does have twins in it, but it doesn't have other types of siblings. So I randomly sample one focal child per mother. So, the birth order of the kid for this mother is going to be sort of changing and randomly selected. And I use a subset of kids that are born between 1983 and 1986, which leaves me with about 2,000 African American and white children. I choose the years 1983 to 1986 in part because it allows me to sort of maximize the gap in the years between this sample and the other sample, but also because it allows me to look at behaviors collected starting in 1986 when kids are age 4. Ultimately, there are 1,600 kids for whom I have complete externalizing behavior problems information, as well as family composition and dynamics and a variety of control variables. I use multiple imputation to deal with item missingness on the predictors, not on the outcome. I do keep the outcome variable in the imputation equation though. Okay, so the other data set is the early childhood longitudinal study birth cohort. So this is a nationally representative sample of children who are born in 2001. And I have developmental information for them at 9 months, age 2, 4, and 5, and 6. So I impose a number of sample restrictions on the ECLSB. First, I restrict it to the roughly 5,700 African American and white children for purposes of just the way that I'm framing the study. And then I look at the 4,000 children who are born to mothers 18 to 29 at birth for a direct comparison in maternal age range to the NLSY, which necessarily has moms 18 to 29 at birth. So one of the things that I raised in the initial framing of this talk is how do you construct an equivalent cohort of moms, right? So is this equivalent cohort of moms who are the exact same age ranges? Perhaps from a biologic perspective you think that's the way to do it. Perhaps you think that the best thing to do, given that we've seen delays in childbearing over this time period, is to look at, say, the 10th to the 75th percentile of kids, of moms' ages at birth in the 1980s. And it turns out the 18 to 29 age range that I have in the 1980s cohort spans the 10th to the 75th percentiles of mothers' ages at birth. And so what I can do is sort of restrict the ECLSB sample to a comparable percentile range of mothers' ages at birth. So this increases the comparison from 18 to 29 to 18 to 32 in the 2001 sample. So I will focus on results from the direct comparison here, but I'm happy to show you in the Q&A results from the sort of broader age range of moms and tell you a little bit about how those results are actually quite similar. And then I drop twins because the ECLSB has an oversample of twins, and I'm left with about 3,000 kids for whom I have externalizing behavior problems at ages 4 and 5, family composition and dynamics, and a range of control variables.
I would be, what am I doing about it? Last slide.
You want? Okay. So one of the other things that was really important in the study was constructing a comparable set of behavior outcomes, right, across both data sets. So I sat down with a number of developmental psychologists and did this in sort of a few different ways. It turns out the results are actually quite robust in which way I do this. But what I did is I looked at the overall externalizing problem scales in both data sets, and I pulled out the specific items that are almost identically worded across both data sets. And those are the results that I will show you here, but the results are actually quite similar. So you can see these are the items in the scale. One thing I will note is that the NLSY behavior problems are based on the child behavior checklist, which has a 3-category response option. So you can report rarely, sometimes, or often, whereas the ECLSB originally has a 5-category response. And so I addressed this change in a variety of different ways. The first way that I dealt with it was I thought about sort of collapsing the 2 extreme categories on either side and said moms who are more likely to report rarely as a result of the presence of a never category or vice versa should just get collapsed into one group. I also tried sort of linearly rescaling the 2 scales. Ultimately, I also do the rescale using the collapsing of the extreme categories, but I also standardize both scales. And the results are the same, sort of regardless of whether or not I standardize.
So,
Yeah.
my question was about the design of the study and actual implementation. Do you think they're the same in terms of telephone, who the interviewers are? It just seems very heroic to do time changes with 2 different data sources.
Yeah.
And so I see you're thinking about this, but what about the actual interview itself in the context of the interview?
Yeah. So they are similar in the sense that both, so I will say the ECLSB just has more stuff. Like it has mother interviews in person, it has paper interviews, it has direct child observations, it has teacher ratings, it has just a variety of different things that the NLSY doesn't have. But I do think that the things that the NLSY does have are also present in the ECLSB, in the sense that the way that the interviews and observations were conducted, for my reading of the code books, there's nothing that jumps out at me as being like hugely different across the 2 implementations of the subsets of things that I'm looking at.
And there's no way we can benchmark the 2, there's no overlap of anything to see if they come out the same in the 2?
So there is overlap. Unfortunately, the issue is that because of the sample design of the NLSY, there's a huge sort of maturation effect of mothers over this time period. So by the time so there are children born in the early 2000s in the NLSY, but they're born to moms who are just dramatically older. What I have done is I've looked at moms who are having kids kind of in the middle of this range in the NLSY, to see whether the sort of trends follow a similar direction, and they do. They're not as sort of pronounced, in part because the ECLSB sample, these kids are coming into schools at the same, after No Child Left Behind has taken effect in US schools in a way that kids that are born in the late 1990s just aren't subject to those yet. So I think there may be some sort of school feedback going on, but I have some results to show you guys on that. So just to sort of highlight though what I'm talking about with regard to the change, right? So the change in scaling, this is sort of the way that I addressed it in terms of collapsing these extremes. For the results that I'm showing you now, these are then standardized. I've also tried sort of thinking about doing the rescaling in other ways to see whether the results are robust, and they are. So to further adjust for the systematic differences in response categories across the items, I also standardize the items within panel, right? So now I'm saying, how are moms rating boys relative to girls within that time period? If there have been changing norms in the ways that reporting happens, that should be at least partially captured by the standardization within panel, within data set. So these are sort of just to give you a sense of the types of predictors that I was looking at. So these are things that range from family resources to family household composition. So I'm looking at family structure at the birth of the child, and also at age 4 and 5, which is when the behaviors that I'm looking at are measured. I'm looking at resident sibling gender composition at age 4 and 5. And sort of controlling the overall number number of children in the household, as this may also play a role. And then I have a number of things related to sort of the non-familial context of care. This is things like whether the child was enrolled in school at the time that the behaviors were measured, and then a variety of child characteristics that are listed here. Okay, so I know I want to move quickly to get through all of the results. So basically what I do is I have these two samples, I append them together. Because I have a pretty left-skewed distribution of these behavior problems, I'm looking at changes in the low tail of the distribution, so I'm using linear probability models to look at who's scoring above the 10th percentile or the 25th percentile in the distribution of these externalizing behavior problems. The reason that I do this in part is for the reason that you'll see these results in just a second. You'll see sort of that's where the action has taken place, but also that these are the kids who have sort of the greatest educational chances, right? Their sort of chances of educational success are quite high because they have pretty low behavior problem scores, and if even these kids' behavior scores are getting rated worse over time, I think that is sort of where there's a lot of sort of room for further examination of what exactly is going on. So I estimate linear probability models, and I want to just move on. So to just highlight this sort of question methodologically of how do we construct a comparable cohort of kids that are born in the 2000s relative to the 1980s, right? And what would constructing an equivalent cohort of mothers look like if we could fast forward these moms who were born in the 1980s to the 2000s? So on the one hand, you might take sort of a biologic perspective and say, what we really care about is comparing moms who are the exact same age, because we don't suspect that biological factors have changed over this time period, and we really want to know, sort of for moms who are the exact same age and have the same education and relationship status at birth, what does their behavior ratings look like? What do their behavior ratings look like? The other way that you might think about this is sort of taking into account the fact that there's been these delays in childbearing and increases in education, rise in sort of complex family structures, and that the meaning of having these things may actually have changed over this time period because they've become more normalized. And so what I do to take this into account in another set of analyses that I can show you during the Q&A if people are interested, is I construct these ratio estimating weights. So what I basically do is I say what an equivalent mom looks like in 2000 compared to into the 1980s is not based on a mom who has the exact same level of education, but a mom who has any college education in the 2000s compared to the 1980s is more equivalent in the sense that we know there's been an expansion in education over this time period. Similarly, given the rise in cohabiting without marriage, comparable moms in the 2000s may not be married to their spouses, but they may be cohabiting with them at birth, and that this is really the comparison that we want to be making across this time period. Similarly, given delays in childbearing, we want to compare moms who are not the exact same ages at birth, but who are similar within rough age bins of about 5 years. And finally, we want to compare moms who range the 10th to 75th percentile of mothers' ages at birth, rather than looking at only moms who are born 18 to 29 in both data sets. So this method would assume that the social meaning has stayed consistent within these categories, even if it's changed across these categories. Okay, so the first research question, just to remind you, was, has the gender gap in early childhood behavior problems among African American children grown over the past 30 years, and if so, where in the behavioral distribution has this occurred? So this just gives you a sense of what we're seeing overall. The left panel is African Americans, the right panel is whites. The left two bars in each are the 1980s, females and males, and the left two are the 2000s. What you can see is the action is really here. So here are African American boys in the 2000s, and you can see that for their standardized externalizing problem scores, that the entire distribution for African American boys has shifted up. So that even the sort of boys with the lowest behavior problem ratings have gotten rated worse over this time period. We don't see this for African American girls who have stayed exactly the same. We don't see this for white boys who have stayed exactly the same. And there has been a bit of a shift up for white girls, but it really is only at the lower tail of the distribution where there was such extreme left skewing in the ratings in the 1980s that sort of in practice, the result of the shift is not super sort of dramatic in terms of what we would expect for white girls.
I mean, you're focusing on the, I don't know, what is the 25th percentile?
Yeah, these are the
If we
25th.
look at the median, though, we get the exact opposite.
Yeah.
thing. The white boys have changed a lot more than the black boys.
Yeah, so, yeah, absolutely. So I am focusing on the left tail because, so it turns out that the shift for African American boys, this segment here is sort of the group that I'm arguing are the ones who have the, these are the boys who have sort of the greatest educational chances, right? Like their opportunities for succeeding in school are the greatest, and if even they are being rated worse over time, this has sort of real consequences for inequality. But I agree with you that, so what I will show you in the Q&A is that these are the results where you're comparing 18 to 29-year-olds in both time periods. If I show you the results from the sort of ratio weights, you'll see that that actually does not show up in those results. So I'm not actually convinced that that is a super robust change, whereas this change shows up throughout. Also in the other results that I can show you, this the high tail of the African American boys distribution has also shifted higher up. So this is sort of the area that I'm seeing the most robust change to different sort of methodological approaches. So just to show you sort of what this means in terms of actual movement within the distributions, so you can see here that this is African American boys in the 2000s, and the same thing for white boys here. It's really much more pronounced, so we're seeing a much sort of more dramatic right shift for African American boys, both in the median, from the low tail to the median of the distribution, and from the median of the distribution to the high tail of the distribution, in a way that we're not seeing for white boys in the same comparison. Okay, so how much of the growth is due to changes in family composition or family gender dynamics? So this just gives you a sense of what's going on here. So in these linear probability models, the coefficient for male represents the gender gap in the 1980s. The 2001 cohort indicator represents the average sort of increase for girls over this time period, and the male times 2001 interaction represents the additional worsening for African American boys in the 2000s. And what you can see is, again, these results are for the 18 to 29 direct comparison in both cohorts. These results are actually, in some regards, they show the same pattern, but they're actually a bit weaker in the sense that they don't show as much statistical significance as shows up when you do the sort of ratio estimating weights, if you're buying into a sort of social change argument here. But what you can see is the same pattern. So essentially there's been a larger, the probability of an African American boy today receiving a score above the 10th percentile is 7.5% higher than in the 1980s and compared to girls in the 2000s. When you look at whether this can be explained by changes in family resources or family structure, you see that it really isn't, the second model. In the third model, when I look at the differences in the presence and also in the effect of having a younger brother in the household, to the question earlier, this is not necessarily a biological younger brother, it's just a co-residing biological brother. We see that actually that entirely explains the higher or the worse ratings for African American boys in the 2000s. When we look at whether it's, maybe just more kids, right? So we can look at whether having a younger sister in the household makes a difference in explaining the increase, and it doesn't. We can look at whether it's potentially just having more boys in the household in general by looking at the presence of an older brother, and we do see some mediation in that overall interaction, not as much as the presence of a younger brother. Similarly, sort of no mediation for the presence of an older sister in the household. So this really seems to be a story about the presence of a younger brother and to some extent the presence of multiple boys in the household driving this worsening rating for African American boys in the 2000s. So the final question was, are family structures and composition implicated because of differential selection into these family types with the rise of non-traditional families over the past 30 years? And so what these results show are linear probability models for African American boys in the 1980s versus the 2000s. This main effect here for child born in 2001 is basically how much more likely is an African American boy in the 2000s to have a younger brother in the household overall. And what you can see is that none of these factors with regard to family resources, mother's relationship status, sibling composition, or parenting strategies sort of lead to a higher probability of having a younger brother in the household. Jen?
Do fathers also report on these comments or only mothers?
Unfortunately, only mothers in the NLSY.
Okay, so how are you thinking about the change in kids who co-reside with only fathers?
Yeah, so to be honest, I haven't been thinking about them in the sense that it's such a large share of kids who co-reside with a mother and not with a biological father. It would be fascinating to look at biological father reports of these things. I've done a little bit of this in the Fragile Families data, which I'm happy to talk about more, but unfortunately these are restricted to mom's reports in large part due to sample design.
So does this show that there's not a significant increase in the likelihood of having brothers or younger brothers or
Yes.
younger brother in the household?
Yes.
Between the cohorts? The change is in the meaning of it, or the effect of it, not in its
Exactly.
composition.
Yes, exactly. So change
Or in the status of that brother.
or in the
Whether
sense of
he's-
brother, which I think
yeah,
is so,
or- yeah.
that's such a great point. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so here's what I can tell you. I've looked at whether, so when you compare African American boys with and without a younger brother, sort of differences in, all of the sort of observable characteristics that I have of them, there's nothing that's jumping out to me with regard to family structure that would, so I went in with the same hypothesis that you had, which is perhaps what this is a situation where you're more likely to have a blended family and a younger brother who's non-biological today than in the 1980s, and that difference there may be some sort of psychological and other phenomenon occurring within the household. So if I'm a mom, I have a baby with one partner, I repartner, have another child, and now with it living with my new partner, maybe I will be more likely to be harsher on my, on the elder son, the child from the earlier relationship, right? So I don't see signs of that with regard to any of the parenting measures that I can see. So I've looked at things like, I've really tried to look at everything that I possibly can think of having some sort of theoretical reason for. So I've looked at things like maternal warmth, cognitive support. I've looked at things like harshness. I've looked at mother's depression ratings and mother's depression scores. Like maybe mom is just more stressed now, and that this is part of what's leading to the worse ratings. Maybe it's an educational expectation thing. Maybe because the outlook for boys today is just not as good, especially for African American boys, given what we know about the rise in incarceration, the rise in zero tolerance policies in schools, and so forth. Maybe educational expectations have gone down and they've actually gone up. So,
But how about fathers? I mean, part of the evolutionary route is that the stepfathers are not investing in the kid that they're not biologically related to. The mother is biologically related to both kids.
the mother is biologically related
But
to
the
both
father
kids.
is not, and he's sort of, so do you see the same thing for father parenting behaviors?
So I don't
You know
have
that.
father parenting behaviors in both, but what I can tell you is that I would suspect to see that in families with social fathers present, if this was a mechanism, so you're right, there is the possibility that this is entirely the new father in the household, and this has no effect on, his presence has no effect on the mom, right, which is possible. But to the extent you believe that there's going to be some sort of effect between the new father and the mother, the biological mother, in her parenting strategies, or that it would show up somewhere in terms of her mental health conditions, her overall expectations for her kids, that I'm not finding anything consistent with that hypothesis.
I wanted to say one quick thing. Isn't it possible that there's also a causal effect on the behavior of the older brother? That having a younger brother may actually provide an opportunity for acting out more, and maybe they're acting out together, but the older brother gets blamed? That seems like an obvious mechanism to add to the list.
Yes, exactly. So that is actually the hypothesis that has gained sort of the most support, in the sense that, one, I think that's entirely plausible, and two, I have a bunch of sort of additional things that I've looked at to see whether I can rule out any of the other hypotheses. It's hard to, because I don't have sort of objective ratings of these behaviors, it's hard to know whether that's actually the case. But I've looked at all of these other hypotheses to try to see whether they gain traction, and they don't. And so this is sort of the hypothesis that I think is the most likely, and it could be the way that you put it, exactly about the older brother actually acting out more, or it could be that the mom has higher expectations for the older brother now that there's a younger brother in the household, and sort of this idea that you have to role model good behavior for your younger brother, and then that's what's leading to the higher ratings. But both are consistent with just different explanations, but for the same general hypothesis you're putting forward. Okay, so just to quickly summarize the findings, and I think I missed there. I think there was one.
Well, I haven't quite created the story for this in my head, but there's this hypothesis out there that what really matters is self-directed play and outside time and things like that. And I'm just thinking, between these two cohorts, that's definitely changed. I don't know how that would differentially affect African Americans versus whites, but if boys are more vulnerable in general, there might be this interaction.
Yeah, so I've looked at, the cognitive support measures that I'm looking at include items about time outside the home. How often do you take your kid to a museum, to a park, to the grocery store, and so forth? Mm-hmm. And I've interacted those by gender and cohort, and nothing. Okay. And actually that result is one of the, I just for simplicity wrote parenting up there, but those items were all included in the different scales for parenting that I was looking at, and they don't explain, it's...
Can I just clarify? So the dependent variable here is mom rates the kid on a dozen or so different things from 1 to 3 or 1 to 5, and you take an average of those and standardize those
within panels.
So can you give a sense of what the change in the dependent variable we're really looking at is here? Is this one more bad behavior a month or a week? Or?
Gotcha. Yeah, so the items are asked with regard to the last 2 months. How often does your kid exhibit the following behaviors? And the rating categories range from sort of rarely to sometimes to often. And what we're seeing on average is sort of a 1 point increase.
So
going from rarely to sometimes, or sometimes to often.
And so is it a big deal or not?
So I think it's a big deal because there's a range of research that shows that even a 1 point increase in an externalizing problem scale carries pretty big consequences for educational outcomes.
And 1 point in this case is rarely to.
I've done that. So that analysis is using the raw scale. So we're not talking about like a standard deviation increase. We're talking about a 1 point increase in predictive power for educational outcomes.
Yeah, 1 point meaning.
A 1 point increase from like rarely to sometimes or sometimes to. Yeah, that kind of 1 point. Yeah. So just to summarize, so the worst behaved African American and white boys are consistently rated worse than girls on these externalizing problems scales, but the entire externalizing problems distribution has shifted up for African American boys, such that even those with the lowest behavior problems, those that are sort of the best behaved, are rated worse over time. There's fewer African American boys with the lowest scores, sort of below the 10th percentile, and more with scores that are around the median or slightly higher, whereas girls have remained relatively constant over this time period. The presence of multiple boys in the household explains the entirety of the reported worsening among African American boys. And this does not appear to be linked to changes in family composition in the sense that African American boys are more likely to have a younger brother today than before. That's not the case. So I think this work sort of has a number of implications. The first is that I think it shows that negative impressions of African American boys start very early in the life course, and these could be due to, as Kristen mentioned, actual changes in behavior, sort of an increasing secular trend in behavior due to the presence of a younger brother in the household, or it could be sort of role model hypothesis that moms are just expecting better behavior from older sons when there's a younger brother in the household. Even African American boys who are most likely to succeed seem to be rated as exhibiting sort of these worsening early behavior problems, which I think is important because we know that early childhood is a critical developmental period, and these early behaviors do predict educational and labor market outcomes down the road. So regardless of true behavior change, these perceptions do have real consequences, though I will say that I think the policy implications of a real versus a perceived behavior change they're quite different, right? And so I don't mean to say that it's not important to know which of the two is happening, but rather that regardless of which is happening, I think it has real consequences, even if the policy implications may be different. And I think it's sort of important to note that mothers, I think, are the least susceptible to things like age for grade bias in reporting these behaviors, and are really highly invested in their son's success. So it's not that we would expect that there would be a clear-cut reason that they would want to sort of game the system or otherwise sort of rate behaviors worse for their sons. So just to conclude, so I think that there's sort of a number of next steps here. The first would be, if I can, sort of compare parent-to-teacher ratings, at least within the 2000s cohort. I don't have teacher data in the 1980s sample, but I could look to see whether these are sort of parent reports that are mirroring things that are happening in schools, such that maybe there's some sort of a teacher-parent feedback happening. I will say that I've looked at these results based on whether or not a child is enrolled in school, just to get a rough cut on whether I think that there's something going on with sort of feedback from the school environment. And the results are not. They don't suggest that. They're consistent regardless of whether a child is enrolled in school or in preschool or kindergarten or not. And I think more work is needed to unpack some of the sibling gender comparisons and whether there's other factors that are driving the younger brother effect among African Americans. So I will stop there, and thanks for your time, and I look forward to your questions too. Field, or
if you're comfortable, please.
So I have two questions, thoughts. One is, I guess fertility for African American women has been pretty flat over this 2-decade period, but there might have been a change. There might now be more of a bimodal distribution with, what I'm trying to suggest is that those women who were having multiple boys in the household now may be more highly selected, that is a smaller proportion of the total than was the case in the 1980 group of women, even though average fertility may be quite similar. It may be distributed differently across family sizes. And the other is, I don't know whether you've gone down this road already, but looking at some interactions of your other boy effect with presence or absence of father, or presence or absence of the old male, or something like that. You might learn something by looking at those if you haven't already.
Mm-hmm. So those are great. When you say proportion of total, do you mean total children that the mother will ever have, or do you mean a different kind of total?
Going back to the selection question, well, as the proportion of African American women with more college education and so on has gone up, I can imagine that there are some with 0 or 1 children, more so than was true in 1980, and others who haven't moved in that direction, who maybe have 3 or 4 kids. There may be a less uniformity. I don't know, that could be totally mistaken, but it would be something to check, because it might be that those women who have multiple boys in the household, presumably have more children overall in the household, are a smaller proportion of the total and therefore have other characteristics, unobserved characteristics that are associated with parenting styles and things that might affect behavior
Yeah.
problems.
Yeah, that's a great point. In terms of the interactions between younger brother and father absence, so I've looked at those at least descriptively, in the sense that I've looked at sort of stratifying the sample. So now I have African American boys with a younger brother compared to those without a younger brother in the 2000s compared to the 1980s. And what I've found is that there isn't a difference in terms of the proportions with a social father in the household compared to a biological father in the household. So I was expecting to find pretty big differences in family composition within those family types. Within boys that have a younger brother versus not, and I'm not seeing those. So that kind of was what veered me away from looking more directly at those interactions, because if they're not showing up descriptively, there would have to be some weird suppression effect going on for that to pop up. But yeah, I mean, I'm really just stumped, to be honest with you. I mean, I keep coming back to sort of what Kristen is saying, which is that by process of ruling out all of these other hypotheses, I'm kind of left with this one hypothesis that I can't sort of test to be true without having objective ratings, but is also the one that I've least ruled out through all of the supplementary analyses, So, I mean, maybe a question for the group is sort of where to go from here, and, at what point to sort of, where to go from here, maybe that's what it is. Yeah.
I have a kind of technical question. I'm curious how you're getting the race for the children in the LSY. Are you grabbing it from the pre-survey screener where they impute the race of the mother? And if so, I'm curious how you're getting white versus black, because I think that it's Hispanic black and not Hispanic non-black, and I'm curious if you've got a sort of mismatch in your comparison compared to equal, or defining that sort of reference group.
So I would love to talk to you more about that. I've been looking for someone who knows the race variables really, really well in the NLSY, because one of the things that I've been thinking about is the possibility that mothers who are repartnered and have a younger brother where there's a younger brother in the household may actually have a partner of a different race, and that different racial composition. So we know that in general, people rate dark-skinned people worse on a lot of sort of these behavioral measures than lighter-skinned people. And so if this is a story of a mom who an African-American mom who repartners with a white or Hispanic new partner, has another child with them, or adopts, takes into the household their children from a prior partnership, that they may be rating the prior son. I mean, it's a little bit of a crazy, convoluted, and actually quite damning story in terms of these processes even playing out within households. But I would love to. I'm using mother's race currently. I would love to hear your thoughts on how I might sort of unpack race of new partner, because I don't think that information is present in the NLSY.
I think we have to stop there. I am sorry.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you very much.